At 6:30 in the morning on October 4th, 1943, the Atlantic was in a foul mood. A northwest gale drove slate-colored swells across the convoy lanes south of Iceland, hammering hull plates and throwing curtains of icy spray over a small American escort carrier riding near the center of 40 merchant ships bound for Britain. Her deck crews had been awake since before dawn, chipping frost from tie-down chains and wiping salt crystals off canopies while the wind cut through wool and leather as if they were paper. Steam curled from exhaust stacks. Engines coughed, then settled into steady roars that vibrated through the thin steel of a ship built quickly, cheaply, and without illusions of grandeur. German naval intelligence had a dismissive phrase for vessels like her. In assessments circulated to U-boat flotillas, they were listed as auxiliary conversions, lightly armored and vulnerable, the product of emergency construction rather than deliberate naval architecture. Submarine officers shortened that to something blunter when speaking among themselves. They called them jeep carriers, implying a poor cousin to fleet carriers, too slow to run and too fragile to fight. For much of 1942, that judgment had not been unreasonable. A torpedo into the hangar deck of one of these ships could turn aviation fuel into an inferno, and early versions had gone down fast when caught without warning. By the autumn of 1943, however, the ocean had begun teaching a harsher lesson. From the carrier's bridge, the convoy resembled a floating industrial city trudging westward at 10 knots. Smoke columns marking the positions of tankers and Liberty ships staggered across miles of water. Around them moved the escorts in restless patterns, destroyers and corvettes zigzagging on assigned bearings, bows knifing into waves as sonar sets thumped out pulses that echoed back through headphones in darkened compartments below. In the Combat Information Center, radar operators leaned toward glowing green scopes, tracking every return and scribbling grease pencil vectors onto plotting boards already cluttered with course lines and wind estimates. Nothing in that room was decorative. Every screen, dial, and headset existed for one purpose: to keep unseen attackers from getting close enough to shoot. On the flight deck forward, 2 Grumman Avengers waited on chocks, their squat noses pointing into the wind, crews already strapped into cramped cockpits that smelled of oil and rubber. Instead of torpedoes meant for cruisers, their bomb bays carried depth charges and racks of sonobuoys designed to float and listen for propellers in the black water below. Their pilots had been briefed to fly low and methodically, sweeping assigned boxes that overlapped like scales around the convoy so that no patch of sea remained unwatched for long. These aircraft did not dash in from distant bases and then vanish with empty tanks. They lived with the convoy, rotating aloft hour after hour. Several miles ahead of the formation, beneath that same gray surface, a German Type 7 submarine edged forward at periscope depth, electric motors whispering as the commander steadied the narrow optics against the roll. Inside the hull, condensation ran down steel frames and pooled on deck plates. The air was thick with diesel fumes and unwashed clothing, every breath recycled through filters that could not quite erase the metallic tang. The hydrophone operator murmured bearings. The navigator whispered speed estimates. Through the lens, the commander counted silhouettes, freighters first, then escorts, and finally something squat and flat-topped sitting stubbornly in the center of the screen. An aircraft carrier. He lingered on it, feeling a flicker of irritation. That was not supposed to be here. Reports had mentioned a few such ships, but BDU analyses still treated them as curiosities rather than central threats. Submarine doctrine assumed that once darkness fell, the surface belonged to the attacker. Aircraft complicated matters only briefly, darting in from coastal bases before fuel forced them home. This carrier was clearly operating inside the convoy screen, launching patrols even in marginal weather. As if to underline the point, one dark shape lifted from her deck, circled low, and slid outward over the waves. Another followed minutes later. The commander lowered the scope and ordered a slow turn to starboard, trying to work himself into an attack position before those aircraft could drift across his projected track. Every option carried risk. Running faster burned batteries needed for escape. Diving deep sacrificed situational awareness. Surfacing to recharge in daylight under aircraft patrols bordered on suicidal. The Atlantic that had once been generous to hunters was shrinking around him, Back aboard the escort carrier, the morning rhythm unfolded with practiced economy. Signalmen relayed reports from the outer screen. Ordnancemen double-checked arming wires. Meteorological officers fed updated wind data to flight control. The ship's loudspeakers crackled with course corrections as the helmsman nudged her into the best launch angle. She had already recorded submarine sightings on this crossing. Some contacts had faded away into nothing. Others had ended with oil slicks spreading across cold water and survivors bobbing in kapok jackets. The difference was not firepower alone. It was endurance. In the early days of the Atlantic War, U-boats had exploited gaps between escort groups, between patrol cycles, between radar sweeps. Escort carriers closed those gaps by refusing to leave. Planes went up. Planes came down. Planes went up again. Darkness no longer guaranteed invisibility when radar sets peered from cockpits and star shells glowed above suspected contacts. A commander who lingered too long beneath a convoy risked being boxed in by aircraft overhead and destroyers converging from all directions. A flashing lamp winked from a corvette off the port bow, followed by a burst of radio traffic that cut through the carrier's control circuits, sonar contact reported. Bearing 185 degrees relative. Range uncertain. In the plotting room, operators slid strategies across charts, aligning the escort's position with the convoy's course, and projected wind drift. The carrier turned slightly into the gale, her bow lifting and falling as deck crews scrambled back to stations. Yellow-shirted directors raised their arms. Engines howled. An Avenger rolled forward, its tail lifting as it reached the deck edge before the gray swallowed it whole. Inside the cockpit, the pilot kept his eyes low on whitecaps racing beneath him while his radioman adjusted frequencies to match the destroyers hunting below. The ocean looked empty, but experience had taught him better. Somewhere under that heaving surface was a steel cylinder filled with men who could tear open a tanker with one well-placed shot. In the submarine, the first sonar pings arrived as hollow thuds that traveled through frames and ribs, each echo slightly sharper than the last. The hydrophone operator stiffened and called a bearing change that suggested a wide circle overhead. The commander ordered the boat deeper, trimming ballast, angling down into darker water where sunlight could not betray a periscope wake. Sweat beaded on foreheads despite the cold as depth gauges crept downward and the pressure hull groaned faintly, a sound every submariner learned to live with. Above him, the patrol aircraft tightened its pattern while destroyers altered course, their screws churning white streaks across the sea as they closed on the datum. What German staff officers still debated in conference rooms was being demonstrated in real time around this convoy. The so-called Jeep carrier was doing exactly what she had been designed to do, pinning predators in place, coordinating surface and air power, and forcing men who once ruled the night to fight for room in a shrinking ocean. The Atlantic campaign had not turned on a single dramatic battle. It was changing through mornings like this one, through endless launches into foul weather, through sonar operators calling out bearings until their voices went hoarse, and through submarine commanders discovering that the spaces they relied on were no longer empty. The escort carrier rode on in the gale, decks slick with spray, aircraft cycling overhead, her presence quietly rewriting assumptions that had once kept merchant ships burning from horizon to horizon. By mid-morning, the sea had settled into long gray swells that lifted the escort carrier's bow and dropped it again with mechanical regularity. The convoy stretching around her in loose columns of freighters burdened with fuel, ammunition, and rations destined for ports still within reach of German bombers. On the carrier's flag bridge, sound-powered telephones rattled with reports from the screening destroyers, each voice clipped by wind and static. Sonar operators had begun calling in intermittent echoes from ahead of the formation, faint returns that slid across plotting boards and vanished before bearings could be fixed. The task group commander ordered the flight deck brought to readiness, and yellow-shirted handlers sprinted through spray to move aircraft into launch position while deck crews broke ice from tie-downs with wooden mallets. Engines coughed, then steadied, propeller wash tearing streamers of vapor from the frozen planks as pilots climbed into cockpits and strapped themselves into seats that were already vibrating with power. The first Avenger lumbered off the bow and sank toward the water before clawing back altitude, followed by a second and a third. their silhouettes swallowed almost immediately by low cloud. Inside one cockpit, a lieutenant from Kansas kept his eyes glued to the instruments while the observer behind him adjusted the frequency on the sonobuoy receiver, the crackle in his headset punctuated by bursts of carrier radio traffic. 20 miles ahead of the convoy, a German submarine captain listened to his own hydrophones and frowned, the steady thrum of merchant screws overlaid by a sharper rhythm that did not belong to any ship. Aircraft engines sounded different underwater, higher-pitched and fleeting, but unmistakable once learned, and the man at the plotting table traced the bearing with a grease pencil that left trembling white arcs across the chart. The order to rig for silent running had already gone out, electric motors engaged, crewmen freezing in place to keep accidental noise from carrying through the hull into the Atlantic. The American pilot spotted the first slick through a break in the cloud deck, a smear of darker water that did not match the surrounding sea, and rolled the Avenger into a shallow turn, while the observer leaned over the side blister and confirmed the swirl with a quick nod. The bombardier slid open the bomb bay doors and armed the depth charges, steel cylinders swaying slightly in their racks as cold air rushed through the fuselage. Below, the submarine's captain ordered a dive to 100 meters and angled for deeper water, knowing the thermal layers might distort sonar returns, but the timing was already wrong. White spray erupted astern as the Avenger's first stick hit, the explosions marching across the surface and punching columns of foam that slapped against the conning tower before the sea closed again. The second pass came from another aircraft, its charges bracketing the wake the U-boat had left behind, shock waves hammering bulkheads and blowing light bulbs from sockets in the control room. Damage reports cascaded forward through the cramped compartments, a leaking gasket in the aft torpedo room, a cracked gauge in the engine space, men gripping rails as the deck canted under the concussion. The captain ordered emergency ballast blown to steady the descent and tried to coax the boat deeper, but a third pattern detonated almost directly overhead, and the hull rang like a bell struck with iron. In the Avenger above, the observer watched oil and debris rise in widening circles and called them out over the radio, his voice tight with concentration rather than triumph, as the pilot throttled back and marked the coordinates for the destroyers racing in from the screen. On the carrier, bridge officers leaned over charts and nodded grimly at the contact reports, already shifting the convoy's track a few degrees to starboard to widen the gap between the merchants and the spreading stain. That afternoon, German naval headquarters in occupied France received the first fragmentary signals from boats that had been shadowing the same shipping lanes, some breaking radio silence long enough to warn of enemy air patrols that seemed to appear without warning over areas once considered safe. Analysts compared the times and positions, pencils tapping against wooden tables as they realized how often the new escort carriers were involved, small, flat-topped ships whose silhouettes had been dismissed in earlier assessments as auxiliary craft unfit for serious combat. Now the pattern was impossible to ignore. Aircraft circling convoys hour after hour, sonobuoys blooming across the sea like metallic flowers, destroyers responding within minutes instead of hours. Orders went out urging commanders to be cautious, to attack only in darkness or heavy weather, but the men at sea knew how quickly conditions could change and how little margin remained once patrol planes were overhead. By late afternoon, a squall line swept across the task group, rain flattening the waves and lowering visibility to a few thousand yards, conditions that once would have favored submerged attackers but now simply forced the carriers to fly lower and closer. Another sonar contact bloomed on a destroyer's screen, steadier this time, and the message reached the flight deck while crews were still rearming aircraft slick with spray. The second strike launched into the weather, wings vanishing into curtains of rain almost as soon as they cleared the bow, pilots navigating by compass headings and shouted bearings while observers scanned the churned surface for periscopes or exhaust plumes. Beneath them, a second submarine crept along the edge of the convoy, batteries running low, captain gambling on a quick surface dash to recharge once the weather closed in, unaware that radar operators on the carrier had already picked up the faintest smear of return, where nothing but sea should have been. Depth charges detonated in uneven rhythm this time, tossed in hurried patterns as the Avengers adjusted to wind gusts and rough air, and one explosion burst so close to the submarine's hull that gauges shattered and a seam opened in the forward battery well. Seawater hissing as it met acid fumes and forced the crew into gas masks that smelled of rubber and sweat. The boat staggered upward, stern lifting uncontrollably, and broke the surface in a froth of bubbles, just long enough for a circling aircraft to rake the deck with machine gun fire before another charge struck home and folded the pressure hull inward. From the carrier's bridge, the distant plume was barely visible through rain squalls, but the radio calls were unmistakable. Voices reciting coordinates and results with professional restraint that did not quite mask the strain of flying so low in such weather. Nightfall found the task group still zigzagging across its assigned lane, flight crews exhausted, faces streaked with oil and salt as they secured aircraft for the hours of darkness ahead, while radar operators kept their eyes fixed on glowing scopes that pulsed with ghostly returns from waves and distant storms. German boats that had survived the day slipped farther away, commanders forced to weigh the dwindling chances of penetrating a screen that seemed to regenerate aircraft and escorts without pause, while American officers tallied fuel states, ammunition expenditures, and the slow but measurable reduction in contacts reported by their hunters. No speeches were made, no celebrations held, only a shared understanding that the balance had shifted another notch, that the convoy was still intact and steaming westward, and that the men on both sides were learning, hour by hour, how unforgiving the new Atlantic War had become under the constant shadow of small carriers and the aircraft they loosed into the cold gray sky. By dawn, on the third day, the convoy had pushed into colder latitudes, where the ocean darkened to slate and wind scoured the decks until steel fittings sang with vibration. A place where frost clung to railings, even after watchstanders chipped it away with gloved hands. The escort carrier rode low under the weight of aviation, fuel, and depth charges, her flight deck streaked with salt and exhaust, as crews cycled through another rotation of patrols that had begun to blur into one long, sleepless vigil. Pilots moved with the careful economy of men who knew they would be climbing back into their aircraft again within hours, faces hollowed by windburn and fatigue, thermoses clutched in mittened hands, while maintenance crews swarmed around engines whose cylinders still ticked with residual heat from the last sortie. In the wardroom, the air smelled of coffee and wet wool, and conversations never strayed far from bearings, sonar contacts, and the growing realization that the enemy was no longer approaching with the same confidence reported in earlier months. German submarines were still there, slipping through layers of cold water and shadow, but their radio traffic had shifted tone in ways Allied intercept officers recognized immediately. Warnings replacing bravado, requests for updated intelligence replacing claims of impending attacks. A veteran U-boat commander, listening to intercepted Allied broadcasts through his headphones while his navigator updated charts under dim red light, could feel the Atlantic narrowing around him, patrol planes overhead by day, radar-equipped escorts prowling by night, patterns that overlapped until there seemed no direction left that did not carry risk. He ordered his boat deeper, conserving batteries and oxygen, choosing patience over aggression in seas that once would have promised opportunity, while the men around him spoke little and moved softly, acutely aware that every pump cycle and dropped wrench could ripple outward through the water like a shouted warning. On the carrier, intelligence officers studied decoded fragments from shore stations and forward listening posts, comparing them with the day's sightings and noting how often submarines broke contact after the first detection instead of pressing attacks. The change was subtle but unmistakable, a hesitation that hinted at cumulative losses and growing uncertainty among crews who had once stalked convoys almost at will. During the morning briefing, the task group commander ran his finger along a grease-penciled route on the chart and spoke quietly about fuel margins and air coverage, reminding his pilots that endurance mattered as much as aggression, that every hour aloft narrowed the enemy's options, even if no bombs were dropped. The men nodded, not because the speech was stirring, but because it matched what they were already seeing through canopies streaked with ice and spray. Another contact flared on a destroyer's sonar shortly before noon, sharper than the ambiguous echoes that plagued operators in heavy seas, and within minutes, Avengers were being spotted forward again, deck crews waving them into place while the ship turned into the wind to give them as much lift as possible. One aircraft staggered airborne with its wheels skimming wave tops before climbing through mist, its crew already calling out bearings and altitude adjustments over the radio as they homed in on the reported position. Below the surface, a submarine that had been trailing the convoy for hours felt the water around its hull suddenly erupt with distant detonations from an earlier attack, and guessed, correctly, that aircraft had found another boat somewhere ahead, a reminder that any contact now carried cascading consequences as escorts converged and skies filled with engines. The Avenger's observer caught the faint shimmer of a periscope feathering the surface between whitecaps and slapped the pilot's shoulder while pointing, the bombardier swinging his sightline forward and opening the bomb bay in a rush of freezing air. The first pattern fell long, geysers marching past the submerged target, but the second bracketed it tightly enough to send shock waves rippling through compartments and knock men off their feet. A third run followed, then a fourth, until oil and fragments began seeping upward in greasy spirals that told a story neither side needed explained. The aircraft orbited long enough to confirm the kill before calling in destroyers that thundered over the coordinates, dropping additional charges out of caution rather than necessity, while the carrier altered course again to keep the convoy's bulk clear of whatever wreckage and lingering torpedoes might still drift below. News of that sinking, and others like it along adjacent routes, flowed back through German Naval Command in clipped, coded bursts that accumulated into grim tallies on wall charts studded with pins, analysts erasing and replacing symbols faster than clerks could keep pace. Officers who had once dismissed escort carriers as inefficient uses of steel now found themselves writing memoranda about persistent air cover and integrated hunter-killer groups, phrases that sounded clinical but masked a deeper alarm about how thoroughly the old assumptions were being dismantled. Submarine commanders received new instructions emphasizing survival and reconnaissance over bold attack, a shift that some accepted with relief and others with resentment, yet all understood that the environment they were operating in had become radically less forgiving. On board the American carrier, the mood remained professional rather than celebratory, the crew too aware of how quickly fortune could turn at sea, too conscious of aircraft lost to mechanical failure, and crews plucked half-frozen from rafts after ditching in heavy weather. In the sick bay, corpsmen treated cases of frostbite and exhaustion alongside the more dramatic injuries that came from deck accidents, while the chaplain moved quietly among mess decks offering conversation rather than sermons, listening to pilots who admitted in low voices that the endless patrols were wearing on them more than flak ever had. They flew, landed, refueled, and launched again, day after day, becoming part of a system whose very monotony was now its greatest strength. As evening settled and the horizon burned briefly with a red smear of winter sunset before collapsing into darkness, radar operators tracked nothing more threatening than distant squalls and the convoy's own escorts, a lull that felt almost suspicious after the previous day's violence. The carrier continued to steam with the merchants clustered close, a moving island of light in the black Atlantic, while below decks, planners updated routes and calculated how long this level of coverage could be sustained before fuel and wear demanded relief. Somewhere far astern, a damaged submarine limped away toward deeper water, its commander sending a short, carefully worded signal that spoke volumes in what it did not say, while farther east other boats turned back entirely, commanders deciding that the odds had shifted too far against them. By the time the task group reached the edge of its assigned patrol zone and prepared to hand the convoy off to another screen, the numbers told a story that no single engagement could capture: fewer attack reports, more aborted approaches, radio intercepts filled with caution instead of confidence. The escort carrier's log recorded it all in precise handwriting: launch times and recoveries, weather conditions, munitions expended, contacts classified and reclassified. A bureaucratic ledger that nevertheless charted the slow constriction of an enemy campaign. When the next carrier slid into position to take over the watch and the tired pilots finally climbed down from their cockpits for more than a few hours' rest, there was no ceremony to mark the transition, only a sense among those aboard that they had participated in something larger than any one battle, a grinding, methodical pressure applied across thousands of miles of ocean. For German naval planners, the lesson would continue to unfold in weeks and months that followed, as charts of lost boats grew crowded, and the spaces where attacks could be attempted shrank under overlapping arcs of Allied air power. While for the men on the escort carriers, the work simply went on. Cold decks, roaring engines, endless gray water, and the quiet conviction that persistence itself had become a weapon. The Atlantic did not change overnight, but somewhere between the launches before dawn and the landings after dark, between sonar pings and spreading oil slicks, the balance tipped again, and both sides felt it, one in the tightening of patrol nets and cautious orders, the other in the steady westward movement of convoys that kept arriving intact despite the dangers below.